Tonight you got to see something you've not seen before. Your words as interpreted through the human voice. Your words as remembered word for word. Your expressions being said aloud rather than being heard in your ears. And I wonder what kinds of things were going through your mind as you watched this.
I found it quite moving. And I was wondering if I was the guy who wrote all that stuff. Just, it's very different from being alone and writing it all and then seeing people perform it. It's very different and very moving, stunning.
And you gave women the full range of characters to play. And you found, or they found here at this space, the right place for it to be said, uncluttered by all of the other things that can get in the way of a theatrical production. So that means that your ideas about women and their role and their strength, from what I read, came from women who you knew, mostly with Southern roots.
Yeah, well, primarily with my mother, but I have to add that all the people in the story are made up. All the women I remember growing up with, they had all been born and raised in the South. And so I developed over time a kind of sensibility about being Southern, even though I was born in Washington and hadn't seen the South until I was 13 or 14 years old. So in a certain sense, I guess I'm kind of a Southern writer. My mother couldn't read or write, and she made a living washing dishes in a French restaurant for most of the time I was growing up. And my feeling has always been that, you know, if we had had a better world, she would have been able to do a lot more with her life than just have children. So I suppose, in a certain sense, I'm kind of doing what she might have been able to do if the world had been better.
As you talked, or as we looked and watched and heard your words, about the need for adventure within the black male from the South, looking for another way to be, another kind of life to practice. Can you talk about the inspiration for that?
I don't really remember what it was that, you know, that made me start out with the story. It might have been just an image of this guy who had been to war and came back and thought he knew all that he should know, and he was ready to go and visit another land. I think my feeling was that I needed to create a guy who, at the end of it all, would realize that he didn't know it all, and that there were men here, but in the story, he's the only man, and they're just girls and women, and even the bird is female. So it's all the way down, and that's the way I want it. You know, Sam is in Israel, but in the story, his words are paraphrased. He never really speaks. The same with the brother. He is the unnamed narrator, is the only man there, swimming in a world of women.
I try to look for some commonality in conversations. I grew up very early in my life, before coming to California, surrounded by also black women. And even though I only had that exposure till maybe I was 9 or 10, I find myself now, when I get into a tight spot, remembering the words of Aunt Pearline or Grandma Lizzie or T, as we call my aunt. And there's something about the South that embeds itself in you.
Yeah, a lot of them speak with a kind of poetry. And so you try to bring that out in just about every line that you can come up with. Sometimes it's very difficult, but other times you can sort of dive into yourself and come up with the right line. And I think probably the best guide I've always had is my mother, the way she talked, which is probably a combination of the way all the women in the story talk.
The other thing we share is an experience. Well, you live your life in Washington, D.C. I lived about 2 years in Washington. You use as the guideposts, street corners and street addresses. Was that to keep you grounded, or just to if we wanted to imagine and go and try to find places like those streets are real,
Yeah.
was there something to be found there?
I think it was important that the houses be real and have the real addresses, the streets be real, even though all the people are imaginary. For some reason, I can't say that it helped me write stories, but it was important for me to make sure that everything was the way I remember it when I was growing up. So that, you know, if you wanted to, you could go to a certain address in any story, and the place would be there if they haven't torn it down. There's a story I wrote called The Store, which was at 5th and O Street. And the story came out in a book, and this woman was doing a story for the city paper, and we were driving around, and we passed 5th and O Street, and the building that the store had been in was gone. And I began to wonder if I would have been able to write this story if I had known the building was no longer there.
Does the Washington that you live in today have any relationships even to your imaginary Washington, or do you imagine a different Washington?
No, when I'm writing, it's about the 50s and 60s. We lived because my mother had only menial jobs, we lived in like 18 different places by the time I was 18. So we moved and moved and moved and moved. And we never really had a certain neighborhood. I can't really go back to any neighborhood and say, yeah, I spent 5 or 6 years here, because we were moving just about every single year. But I moved back to Washington in '04, and I live in a part of the city that we never lived in when I was growing up. I live in Washington, but I'm not really a part of the place. It's a place I don't think my mother would recognize if she were alive. It's a place where they're kicking out the kind of people that we were when I was growing up. So it's, in a certain sense, I'm glad that I don't have a neighborhood to go back to, because I would probably, be upset to see how things have changed.
Well, you must be upset today, because I think probably all of us can think that we live in a neighborhood where people are being kicked out today. That seems to be America. And that leads us to modern times, if we can. And that is the impression, or if you have gotten to that point, where you start to formulate some principles about the world we live in now and where it's going. And we know your most famous title, Concerns, the world.
No, whenever I'm doing something, I never have an agenda. I never have an issue that I want to get across. But I am who I am, and so, I couldn't, of course, write a pro-slavery novel. When I wrote the novel, what happened is that it was just after Reagan had been president, and during his presidency, all these black conservatives had come out talking about how wonderful America was, and there's no more racism and all the rest of it. And along with that, I remembered a line, a footnote when I was in college, that there had been black slave owners. So these black conservatives, along with black ball players and black movie stars and black singers, I said, all of those people with no consciences, those are the people who would own slaves if they were legal. So I didn't really want to write about black conservatives. I just remembered the line that there had been black slave owners, and I went back to 1855 Virginia. There is a kind of issue there, but it was never in the forefront of my mind. But I am who I am, and so it's there nevertheless, but I believe.
There would seem to be lots of rich material for the beginnings.
Yeah, I'll leave the black conservatives and all those people to somebody else. You got to have a certain feeling for people, even though they're bad, and I can't really summon that up.
Well, I guess the other thing, today there was a quote from President Obama talking about today's world. And he thinks that what we went through, or may be going through, is that we've lost the ability to talk to one another, that we're glued with reading fragments of thoughts of others, or dealing only with those people
Yeah.
who say what it is we say and hear back what we think. And I wonder what you might think the impact, or do you even
Yeah.
agree with that theory?
It's not something I really think about very much. I don't even read the newspapers very much anymore. And I have to say, that kind of thinking where people are not listening, it's primarily on the other side. Those people have been for decades. They will tell you at noon that it's midnight, and they won't blink an eye. They've gotten to the point where lies just flow out of them as if they're telling the truth. And it's quite scary because you really can't, it seems, go back to a time when, truth was truth. It's very sad, and it's scary. So, but I don't, it's not something that I feel I want to write about. I really couldn't come up with characters to develop that idea. It's just something I think about, and if I really wanted to talk about it, I probably would put it in an essay. It wouldn't really work in fiction. When you're writing, when ideas are foremost in fiction, then the characters take a back seat.
What do you want to write about today? Anything
No,
you can think of? We have such a small world, in a sense, where you can know a little about everybody and everything.
I don't know. I don't have anything right now, but next week, I might, next month.
Well, we don't have a lot of time, and we're going to try to get to some questions from the audience. But of the characters that you created that we shared tonight, here, at least the concept that we got through this production, you made a strong statement about the South and how people knew what the South was, and they sort of knew how to escape from it, and they could get in a wagon and have people take them from place to place and be pretty certain what they'd find when they got there. I look upon that as a real loss, that sense of certainty about if you took certain steps, you could get certain places.
Yeah, and I think that primarily comes from country people. I think once the people began moving to the cities, a lot of that was lost. I think there was a kind of cohesiveness that country people had. And then once they moved to the cities, for a number of reasons, all of that fell away. When the story, I think, probably when I was doing the story, it was just, the effort was to make these people real, to make the dialogue real, and to find a way to a logical and believable end. That was all, it's nice if people who aren't black like the story, fine, but I wasn't out to win them over. In the task of making these people real, what you have to grab on are things that the reader will understand and can accept. And so you go for things like that. Maybe in the universe of slaves there was a man who took on the name of his dead friend, perhaps. But I didn't know it. I just wanted the world that these people have lived in to be believable to a reader. And having a man take the name of his good friend, his dead friend, I think was something I felt would help the story along. It's in the end, with the fiction stuff, it's all untrue, of course, but what you have to do is put in enough spices and good stuff so that the reader will eat it up. So it's all lies, but you got to pretty the lies up. So that's but also I think probably to make the character believable, but I think it was also something that people felt, that people, because the guy was killed walking back from seeing his wife, and I think if you love someone like this guy loved his friend, you just see the utter horror of someone like that gone, and you just go on and try to live the life that he would have lived. The same way I was talking about, my mother couldn't do anything but menial jobs. So, I come along and I do what maybe she would have done.
Mothers do really impress you. My mother went back to school at 75 to get her high school diploma. And I was never so proud of anybody because it was a big move. Mothers can really inspire.
No process, it's all just one hard word after another. You might wake up one morning and you can see Jack and Jill walking down the road with the pail, and they're going to go up the hill to get water. And what happens is that, you have to create a world to explain why they have to go up the hill, who owns the water, how they came to be living in wherever they're living. Is there a mother and a father? Is there a grandmother across the road? It just starts, you wake up one morning, there's Jack and Jill going down the hill. And you just go from there, create the whole world that they live in. It's not anything, the writers out there who talk about, I don't know what my characters are going to be doing, I get in and then, it's just one hard word after another, and that's all it is. It's work.
I'm going to steal that word, one hard word after the other, because it's that way.